As we discussed in the last lecture, Lane drafted a juvenile version of Pioneer Girl in the summer of 1930 and sent it off to someone somewhere who was connected with children's book publishing at the time. From August 18, 1930 until February 15, 1931, Lane's diary is silent about the Pioneer Girl juvenile, which we now know as When Grandma Was a Little Girl. In February 1931, Lane was in New York. She had left Rocky Ridge Farm in October 1930 to meet with her literary agent, to make contacts with editors, and to market the adult version of Pioneer Girl. But on February 15, 1931, Lane's diary records that she had returned to New York City from West Nyack, New York, where she'd been staying with Berta and Elmer Hayter. There she had met with Marion Fury of the children's book department at Alfred A. Knopf, a prominent book publisher whose company is still around today. Lane wrote, "Marion Fury takes Pioneer Girl juvenile. Berta Hayter had submitted When Grandma Was a Little Girl to Marion Fury at Knopf, and then arranged a meeting between Lane and Fury to discuss the manuscript. From the context of subsequent correspondence, it's clear that Fury always understood that the manuscript was Wilder's, not Lane's. So while Lane herself may have extrapolated material from Pioneer Girl, embellished it, and transformed it into juvenile fiction, she did not consider herself the author. Juvenile Pioneer Girl, When Grandma Was a Little Girl, was her mother's work. You make such perfect pictures of everything, and the characters are absolutely real. It is really your own work, practically word for word," Lane wrote her mother. Lane's attitude toward the work is critically important. She recognized the material as her mother's right from the beginning, although Wilder knew nothing about this version of Pioneer Girl until Rose briefed her on the manuscript after Marion Fury at Knopf had expressed an interest in the manuscript. "It is your father's stories," Lane wrote, "taken out of the long Pioneer Girl manuscript and strung together, as you will see." And please note that at this point, Knopf really hadn't purchased Pioneer Girl or even made an offer. Rather, the publisher had expressed an interest in the manuscript. Knopf wasn't yet ready to buy the manuscript. And as I point out in Laura Ingalls Wilder, A Writer's Life, this wasn't unusual in 1931, nor is it unusual today, especially in children's publishing. A manuscript will often catch an editor's eye, but the project needs more work. And until that editor sees how effectively and thoroughly a writer can revise a manuscript, she isn't about to offer a contract. So in Fury's first editorial letters to Wilder, she complimented the work, but simultaneously asked for revisions. "I like the material you have used," she wrote. "It covers a period in American history about which very little has been written, and almost nothing for boys and girls." But then she went on to say, "Would you be willing to make some editorial changes on the manuscript?" First, she wanted Wilder to add more details about the everyday life of the pioneers, such as the making of bullets, what they eat and wear, etc. The manuscript came in at just over 20 typewritten pages. It didn't have the heft yet to be a novel. Fury also felt that something was off in the manuscript, what writers and editors called the voice of a piece. The draft of the manuscript she had seen in West Nyack didn't convey the true character of the book. What she was getting at here was the grandma character herself, the fictional voice of an old lady narrating the story. With an adult as the main character in the manuscript, the distance between the reader, protagonist, and her story was too great. A children's book needed a young protagonist and a young voice. Let's look at this example from the surviving draft of When Grandma Was a Little Girl. When a wolf howls at night, Grandma knew that wolves ate little girls, but Grandma was safe inside the log walls. the voice of this manuscript, indeed the main character, is Grandma, not a child. In other words, the approach Lane would use later in Old Hometown and here in the juvenile Pioneer Girl lacked a young reader's perspective and a believable childlike main character. Creatively speaking, finding the right voice for When Grandma Was a Little Girl would be Wilder's biggest challenge when she began revisions for the original manuscript. Lane herself wasn't sure her mother was up to the challenge. After explaining the difference between first person and third person, Lane wrote her mother that, "I will change it into the third person for you." This passage reveals that perhaps Lane herself didn't understand, at least initially, the depth of the revision Marion Fury was asking for. Changing pronouns from I to she doesn't really transform the voice of a novel. It doesn't automatically shift perspective in a meaningful way or deepen the main character. If Wilder wrote back to Lane addressing the issue of voice specifically, that correspondence no longer survives. But she did dive into the revisions herself, and as I pointed out in the last lecture, she probably corrected the setting for the story from the big woods in Michigan to the big woods in Wisconsin. She also ignored Lane's offer to make the changes in point of view. Wilder tackled that herself, getting closer in her first draft revision to just the right voice for this book. Once upon a time, long, long ago, a little girl lived in the big woods of Wisconsin in a little gray house made of logs. She wrote this revision in pencil on ordinary lined school tablets. I want to spend a bit more time here describing the business of publication as it relates to this book. This is a subject we don't often discuss in literature classes, but I think an understanding of how writers and editors work together within the context of publishing adds a deeper understanding of not just how writers work, but how their final texts come into being. When I was a kid, I thought writers heard some kind of divine dictation, like Moses receiving the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, that writers just sat down and wrote out their stories perfectly and brilliantly the first time. When I got a little older and first became aware of editors as a professional group, I assumed that editors just corrected an occasional misspelled word or typo. But in fact, editors guide writers through the artistic process, providing suggestions on such issues as structure, plot, voice, character, and point of view. Where to begin a novel and where to end it, which characters to keep and which ones to cut. In other words, publishing is a collaborative process. The guidance an editor provides to a writer shapes the final published text readers see in print, as well as their perceptions of the author herself. So this is one reason why I think it's important to pause and examine the publication process for Wilder's first book. It gives us a rare glimpse into the collaborative artistry of a writer working with her editor.